Good afternoon, my friends. This is the Grimflayer. Hope you're all doing very well today, and it is time for Pioneer Banhammer, Round 3. Once upon a time, Field of the Dead and Smuggler's Copter are no more in the newest format of Magic the Gathering. They have all been smashed by the Banhammer. So, we are going to talk about each ban. We're going to talk about the rationale. We're going to analyze the rationale. We're going to analyze the bans. And we are also going to talk about my predictions for how the meta shakes out in the wake of these bans as far as our beloved green-black mid-range archetype is concerned. So we're going to dive right into it. I first just want to mention that with the first two editions of Pioneer Banhammer on this channel, I was right on top of it. I was right on the heels of the Banhammer, giving my hot take fresh off the presses. But this time around, what can I say? On Monday, I was too busy uploading an epic modern Jund League instead of being on top of Pioneer. So go check out that Jund League. That was a really fun one if you're interested in anything like that. But just for the sake of continuity, for the sake of the analysis, even though it's a couple days later than I would have preferred, we are going to dive into the Pioneer Banhammer talk. Let's do it. Alright guys, so let's take a look at what they have to say here. What have they had to say for themselves? Over the last several days, a series of Pioneer tournaments were held. The results of these tournaments and data from league plays show how the environment has evolved under further competitive pressure. While the results look promising and changes have been moving the format in a good direction, our data shows three outstanding issues which are preventing the metagame from arriving at a better balance. These are: bullet point number 1, the strength of mono-black aggro and other aggressive decks featuring Smuggler's Copter. Bullet point 2, that Field of the Dead ramp decks are suppressing controlling and reactive decks. And bullet point 3, the general prevalence and dominance of green decks as a group, with Once Upon a Time being a key common factor to those decks' success. As a result, they will be banned. We believe that these changes will result in greater diversity among aggressive decks, a clear role in the metagame for reactive and controlling decks, and a push toward better color balance among competitive decks. This weekly rapid iteration of the ban list in the early days of Pioneer, as an alternative to launching the format with a pre-populated ban list, has been an interesting and positive experiment thus far. We've been able to use real-world data and results to arrive at what we believe is a smaller and more accurate ban list that we hope will provide a fun, dynamic metagame compared to a preemptive approach. Our plan remains to slow the pace of changes as we approach the new year, and we hope to sync up Pioneer changes with the regularly scheduled BNR announcements for all formats starting early next year. After that time, we expect the frequency of changes to Pioneer to be closer to that of non-rotating formats. Okay, so a lot of that is just PR, a lot of it is fluff, a lot of it is just buzzwords, frankly, diversity, interesting, positive, fun, dynamic, etc. So I don't disagree with any of it, but the thing that I would like to point out before we talk about the specific cards, which we're going to do in a little bit, I do want to point out something that I found interesting. So if we go back to November 4th for the first ban list update to Pioneer, besides the one that it started with, which was the fetch lands, we had these three cards banned. Remember this? Feel old yet? Felidar Guardian Leyline and Oath of Nissa. So look how much they wrote about it. Look how much they wrote about this. Each card has a paragraph dedicated to it, several sentences dedicated to each card, and there's like a more fleshed out introduction as well, a more specific and fleshed out intro. So that's what they started off writing. Then the next update that had any changes was November 11th, which is Veil of Summer. And this is a much shorter entry, but Veil of Summer still had several sentences written about it. This entire paragraph, besides the first sentence, is basically explaining why they banned Veil of Summer specifically. Now, no changes until 2 days ago, December 2nd, and we're reduced to this. We're reduced to a sentence fragment in bullet point form. And that's it for explaining each ban in particular. Again, everything besides that is basically a generality or a buzzword. And there's nothing wrong with including those, but we, over time, over this last month, have seen shorter and shorter explanations for each individual ban. And I think that's very interesting, and here's my analysis of why they're doing that. So, if they had tossed us right in the deep end, banning Leyline and Felidar Guardian and all the rest, with just a bullet point explanation, people would have been very unhappy because we are used to these regularly scheduled, quarterly or so updates with a relatively lengthy explanation attached to any changes that get made. So they started off kind of coming close to that, and then over time they are weaning us away from that down to the point where now for Pioneer bans, this is what we can maybe expect, just a simple bullet point by way of explanation for each new ban. Now, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but the reason I think it's worth pointing that out is because even though they say that over time their goal, and it's a short-term goal, it's in the next few months, they want to slow their roll on changing Pioneer, they want to get it closer to that of other non-rotating formats, that's all well and good, I'm sure that is their goal. But I think we're in for definitely a good amount of bans prior to that. Next few weeks, next 2-3 months maybe, it's impossible to say, but some kind of time frame within that range, I think we're going to get more bans. I think they at least expect to have to give us more bans. And, if there were not any more danger cards on their radar, they would probably have written a more lengthy explanation and treated it with a little bit more gravity this time around. But instead, they're just kind of like, this is banned, that's banned, this is banned, very brief explanations. And then they say, later on, we're going to slow down the bans, like early next year. So that's my take on this, is we are going to probably be seeing several more bans before they do hit their stride and slow their roll and make Pioneer more, Pioneer players will be given the all clear to not be looking around around every corner for a looming ban, right? So I thought that was a really interesting thought that was worth pointing out, the disparity there, but let's take a look at each individual card. Alright, let's talk about Once Upon a Time first. I'm pretty happy this card is gone, not gonna lie. The takeaway here for me is we need to be really careful going forward. Really, really careful about designing any kind of free spell. The fact that Once Upon a Time is a free spell, even if it's conditional, means that its ceiling is so incredibly high that if the floor is acceptably low, you've got kind of a busted card on your hands. That's just kind of how it goes. Lots of different factors gate the playability of a card, but the most important one is the mana cost. And when the mana cost can be as low as 0, you're playing with fire. You just really are. So Once Upon a Time is a pretty significant design mistake, in my opinion. I am very glad to see it go. I don't think it adds interesting gameplay, really. I think, especially in a slower and less powerful format like Pioneer, it is way too ubiquitous. Just like a card that there's not many great reasons not to play. We talk a lot about green-black mid-range on this channel, and philosophically, like, in a vacuum, assuming a normal power level, Once Upon a Time is not a playable card in green-black mid-range, because the nature of mid-range decks is that you want to extend the game, you want to have the right answers at the right times, and you can win the game with a proverbial ham sandwich. You can take it over with any of your threats. But the things that you need to find at the right times in the right places are your answer cards. So the fact that Once Upon a Time does not generally tutor for answer cards, things like Murderous Rider can be exceptions here, but generally you would want card selection that finds instant sorceries, planeswalkers, not creatures or lands. So this is not like a good green-black X mid-range card at all, in theory. But in practice, if somebody said, hey, Flayer, what do you think of my green-black rock list for Pioneer, and they had 4 Once Upon a Time in it, as long as it was a cohesive shell otherwise, and as long as they were kind of maximizing the synergy, I would not have said, oh, Once Upon a Time's not good enough, you shouldn't play it. It was just that good, so I'm pretty happy to see it gone. Again, a design mistake, and going to also reduce the dominance of green a little bit, one assumes, and that's been a goal of theirs as well, so yeah, sounds good to me. Alright, next up we got Field of the Dead. So, Field of the Dead. They said this suppresses reactive and control decks. That's very true, because the issue with Field of the Dead is it has unmatched late game inevitability. When you're playing a Field of the Dead deck and your Field of the Dead is online because you have 7 or more lands with different names, anything you draw off the top of your deck is gas. Because if you draw a land, you get to make zombies off of Field of the Dead. If you don't draw a land, you've drawn action. Whereas any other fair deck, any other grindy deck, even unfair decks, even combo decks, they have that fail rate. We have variance built into this game with the fact that you can draw dead with lands, or you can get lands screwed in the early game, not have enough lands. That's arguably the biggest source of variance in all of Magic. So the fact that these big mana decks, Valakut is another example of this in Modern, the fact that they have inevitability rendering their top decks basically 100% live, it's just not very healthy gameplay. Now, I'm not saying Valakut is broken in Modern or anything like that, but there are kind of inherent structural flaws with this type of inevitability. And in Pioneer, where the format's a lot slower and we don't have as many tools to effectively combat land-based strategies, and we also don't have the speed of opposing aggro decks to really punish big mana stuff, yeah, Field of the Dead definitely does not generate healthy, fun, or interesting gameplay. I think the best thing you could say for it is it maybe generates interesting deck building, but this game, bans have got to be about the enjoyability and the fairness of play, and Field of the Dead therefore had to go. I think very justifiably. So, cool name, cool theme. I like the art. I like this kind of minimalist art. I like the cracked desert and the zombies coming out. It's all cool, but that's where the coolness ends for me. A miserable card to play against. Definitely on board with the ban. And the final casualty to discuss is Smuggler's Copter. Now, I believe that this is the least justifiable ban they have made so far. Doesn't mean I think it's unjustifiable, just the least justifiable. And I also think it is the most likely to be overturned in the future. I do not imagine that Smuggler's Copter will stay on the ban list forever. Whereas something like Veil of Summer, I don't see why they would ever unban Veil of Summer or Felidar Guardian, unless the format changes to the point where it's unrecognizable from what it is now. That said, Smuggler's Copter, if it really is just ubiquitous in aggro decks, which it kind of seems to have been, then I understand why they ban it. Like, the fact that something appears just at minimal deck building cost with almost no downside, it's just very efficient, it just makes the format become a little bit stale feeling. Smuggler's Copter mirrors, how interesting is that? Not terribly interesting, and the fact that it does have evasion, maybe rendering some of the fairer strategies or the more block the attack step. When the attack step is interesting and when blocking decisions are interesting, that's usually a sign of a healthy format. If you're just, looter scooter flying over everything, I just don't know how interesting this card is. So even on that note, I think this was kind of the least urgent and the least necessary of the bans, but I don't dislike the ban. I see why they did it. And unlike Field of the Dead, and unlike Once Upon a Time, this is just subjective, but I don't even like the theme of Smuggler's Copter. I don't like Kaladesh block. Doesn't do it for me, doesn't cut it for me. We're playing a fantasy-based game. I don't like the steampunk stuff. I don't really like the technology-based stuff. I like my fantasy traditional, and props to them for exploring a different style plane, but it didn't hit it out of the park for me thematically. So yeah, not heartbroken to see Smuggler's Copter gone, but again, wouldn't be surprised to see it unbanned at some point in the future, and I don't think it's an egregious decision either way. Okay, my friends, so to close out this video, let's talk about what these bans mean for the prospects of green-black rock in Pioneer. So, it's worth looking at most played cards in Pioneer for a couple reasons. The first one is just to, give more context for the bans. Once Upon a Time, by far the most played card in the format. Smuggler's Copter, number 3. And Field of the Dead not making the list, but of course that's a more, narrow card by definition. Not going to see play in as many decks. So that just really drives home how strong these cards were, but it's also worth looking at this. So of the 8 cards that remain, all of them could in theory see play in green-black rock except OuaT. And OuaT, of course, could see play in green-black-blue in Sultai Midrange. So we have Thoughtseize and Fatal Push seeming to be the 2 premier interactive spells of the format. Duress also seeing a lot of play, another form of interaction. Llanowar Elves, not a traditionally mid-range card, but I have seen lists playing them, and I've gotta say, it loses a little bit of equity without Smuggler's Copter around. Maybe this card will drop off as well, but a really reliable mana dork, more consistently reliable maybe than Deathrite Shaman or Gilded Goose, despite not having the other value upsides of the latter cards. Maybe this is going to be better than it seemed to be in mid-range decks, at the inception of the format. In other words, maybe Llanowar Elves is a little bit of unexplored territory for BG Rock. I don't know. Elvish Mystic, obviously, same thing applies. Murderous Rider, all-star of the format, classic mid-range value. I even like this card in Modern Rock. Definitely should be a very prominent feature of any Pioneer Rock deck. And then Scrap Heap Scrounger, yeah, maybe not quite the most traditional Rock card, but it is, in theory, playable there. So I do want to point out that we have the green-black core in place. And this is just what I predicted at the beginning, that as the format takes a few skims off the top a little bit with some bans, and as the format clarifies, green-black will emerge as a very, very strong core. This is exactly what I predicted, but it is not all roses. In fact, now that Field of the Dead is banned and we don't need to play, the demand for Field of Ruin is not as high, and maybe the other changes, slowing down some of the aggro decks a little bit, I think the incentive to splash a third color in a green-black deck, most probably blue, given the presence of OuaT plus some other really powerful things, I think that got even higher. So this is a little bit bittersweet if you do want to play a 2-color rock deck, because, again, on the one hand, we have the interaction, and we have Decay and Trophy and all kinds of other great stuff that's not even on this top 10 list. Just yet more incentives to really push our color pairing to the very top. But again, that third color splashing for blue, it's looking really hard to pass up, just if we're trying to be objective. So that is where I see things. Now, I will say I have actually not played Pioneer at all in a couple weeks. I've been really hyped about Modern. I've had a lot of Modern donation leagues come up, and I've been enjoying just my own Modern decks on top of that. So maybe my perspective is incomplete. Maybe my perspective is a little bit dated here. You, my friends, will have to let me know. But that's where my headspace is at. That's what I'm thinking. Let me know whether you agree that the third color is more or less the way to go, or whether you see a really good path forward for green-black rock. Now, I had reached the conclusion after my last league that a BG rock deck, a fair, grindy deck, needs a form of more consistent inevitability than just having like a generically good top end. So we're looking at something like Seasons Past, or I was starting to really look favorably upon that Field of the Dead Golgari Lands deck, but of course that's no longer going to be around in its previous form, at least. So let me know what you think. Let me know if you think it's 2 colors time to shine, or if we should be considering Sultai for the near future. I gotta say that my interest in playing Sultai and Pioneer on a regular basis is not that high as long as OuaT's around. I don't think OuaT's going to be around forever. I'd rather kind of play Modern and wait till OuaT gets banned, rather than try to buy into Sultai and really get to know it. I just don't see OuaT lasting. But again, on that too, I could be wrong. I'm just giving you my thoughts. I'm just giving you my predictions. So let's close it off here, my friends. Let me know what you think about all this. I look forward, as always, to learning from you in the comments section, interacting with you there. Thank you to all Patreon supporters who do make this content possible, and I will talk to you soon. Hope everybody out there has a wonderful day.